We know that water is composed of an oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, so is H2O. But what do these symbols right here mean if you've seen them before? So essentially they represent that an atom has a slightly negative charge if there's a minus, or a slightly positive charge if there's a plus. Now, why would an atom have a slightly positive or negative charge? Well, this comes down to the distribution of electrons, okay? In polar molecules that we're going to look at in a second, the electrons are unequally distributed. So you'll see that this oxygen has the electrons closer to it than the hydrogens, okay? We know that electrons are negatively charged, and because the oxygen has the electrons closer to it, it gives it a slightly negative charge. Now, as I said before, this means that water is polar. And have in mind that this is because the electrons are unequally distributed, because the oxygen is more electronegative, okay? Because it's more electronegative than hydrogen, that's why the electrons are closer to it. And electronegativity is how strongly an atom pulls shared electrons. Moving on, we have that water also is a covalent bond because it's between non-metals. Oxygen is not a metal and neither is hydrogen. Now, water is important for various reasons. Firstly, cytoplasm, which many cells or all cells contain, is water-based. So without it, life would not exist. It's also a medium or a place for metabolic reactions to happen or chemical reactions. Plasma membranes can only function in H2O as well in water, and it is also a medium or a facilitator of lyse processes due to its solvent properties, so it can dissolve solutes or other substances. Now, we've just looked at the bonds within a molecule. Let's have a look at the bonds with different molecules, okay? This is going to happen between the hydrogens and the oxygens, and they are called hydrogen bonds, okay? They also make water cohesive. So when a substance is cohesive, it means that its different molecules can form bonds together, okay? In this case, hydrogen bonds, which are weak due to the partial charges, the slightly positive charge of the hydrogen and the slightly negative charge of the oxygen, because remember that water is polar. And also have in mind that the bonds between the oxygens and the hydrogens, these gray bonds right here, are covalent. They are strong, and they're between non-metals, as I said before. Going back to cohesion, we'll see that it's going to be used in nature. A main example of this would be plants that carry up the water from their roots to their leaves using the cohesion of water to pull water up their xylem, which is in their stem, okay? Another example would be water striders, okay? We know that water striders use the surface tension of water to walk on it, okay? So what is surface tension? Surface tension is essentially the force caused by the hydrogen bonds always breaking, okay? So remember that the hydrogen bonds are weak, as I said before, and so they're constantly going to break and form together again, and this causes something called surface tension, which water striders are going to use. Lastly, there's cohesion, but there's also adhesion, okay? This is when a certain molecule is going to attach to a different type of molecule, and water molecules have adhesion, which means that they attract or they connect with other different polar or charged substances or materials. This is also why things get wet in the first place. Adhesion makes the process of capillary action to be possible. So what is this process? It's essentially when water or a liquid is pulled through a narrow space due to the combination of cohesion and adhesion. So the water must be together to go up together, so that's where the cohesion comes from, and must also stick to the walls of the tube it's going through. That's why it also has adhesion. So When there's more adhesion than cohesion, this is when capillary reaction is going to happen, okay? Also have in mind that the thinner the tube, the more capillary reaction there's going to be. We know that a more electronegative atom is going to attract the electrons more to it in a shared bond, okay? But what actually decides whether an atom is more or less electronegative? So there's two factors we're going to look at. Firstly, the number of protons in the nucleus. So you should know that protons are positively charged and they're in the nucleus, the center of the cell, and that positive charges attract negative charges. And what's negatively charged? Electrons. That's why the more positively charged the nucleus is, the more protons it has, the more it's going to attract electrons. The other factor to have in mind is the orbital levels of the atom. The more orbital levels, the more the pull on the shared electrons is going to decrease, because if there's more layers, the electrons are going to be further away from the nucleus, okay? And because they're further away from the nucleus, they are less attracted to it. The other negatively charged electrons will shield them. So these electrons that were attracted here are going to act as a shield for future electrons that might want to come in, okay? That's a horrible drawing, but you get what I mean. There's a very important rule when it comes to polar and non-polar molecules, and it's that polar dissolves in polar and non-polar dissolves in non-polar. So non-polar cannot dissolve in polar and polar cannot dissolve in non-polar, okay? That should make sense. Looking at an example of this, we have different parts of a cell membrane where hydrophilic molecules, which are polar, will dissolve in water, okay? And they're going to be in the outskirts of the cell membrane. These heads, these balls you see right here, are going to be these hydrophilic molecules. Now looking at hydrophobic molecules, these are non-polar, so they don't dissolve in water because water is polar. There are barriers that are going to block polar molecules from entering the cell, so they're useful to our cells. Now, water is going to flow through the aquaporins, this structure right here, hydrophilic interior. Water flows through hydrophilic interiors, not through hydrophobic interiors, okay? Now, this part right here is actually hydrophobic, and is the hydrophobic exterior that acts as a barrier for water, okay? So hydrophobic areas will not have water around them. Instead, it's going to be hydrophilic interiors, okay, if that makes sense. Hemolymph plasma in animals uses water as a solvent. Okay, what does this mean? So firstly, remember that hemolymph is essentially blood in animals, okay? And plasma is a component of blood that contains water as a solvent, so a substance that dissolves the solutes, okay? So water also, apart from dissolving, transports hydrophilic molecules, okay? Not hydrophobic. Hydrophobic is, think about phobic, scared of water. Now, if we look at the structure of oxygen, we'll see that because both atoms have the same amount of protons, you know, it's O2, so they're both oxygen atoms. In this case, the electrons are equally distributed. This means that oxygen is non-polar, because remember that polar molecules have electrons that are unequally distributed, okay? So it doesn't dissolve in water, which is polar, because to dissolve in water, you need to be polar, and oxygen is not polar, okay? Now, because oxygen cannot dissolve in water, it cannot dissolve in the plasma of hemolymph or blood. How do we transport it? Okay, so we do this in the hemoglobin of red blood cells. Yes, as you can see here. So, moving on. Enzymes also need water, and they need it to keep a proper shape, the complementary shape, though this is for another topic. An example of this would be amylase, which breaks starch from, for example, bread into sugars in saliva or water, okay? Plants also use water, and they use it to transport dissolved sugars and other organic molecules, such as amino acids in their phloem sap. So looking at their phloem sap, you should know the phloem is a certain transport tube that plants use. So this sap is mainly transporting sucrose, the sugar, and is transported as a soluble solute in water, so it is dissolved in water. Let's have a look at some physical properties of water, starting with viscosity. So all liquids have this property. It is essentially the energy needed to change the shape of a liquid. Now, water has lower viscosity compared to other liquids. For example, if we compare it to honey, we'll see that changing the shape of honey is harder than changing the shape of water. So swimming, for example, would be easier in water, if that makes sense. Now, buoyancy is essentially the upward force, which is contrary to gravity. So, for example, when you put something, when you throw a ball underwater and it's gonna, well, obviously fall into the water, it's gonna rise up again, and that would be known as buoyancy. Specific heat capacity is the energy required to raise 1 kilogram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius, and water has a high specific heat capacity. Okay, this means that when animals adapt to a certain, or well, organisms in general, adapt to a certain temperature of water, well, that temperature will not change a lot because of its high specific heat capacity, if that makes sense. Okay, so this helps water be a better medium for life. Lastly, let's look at thermal conductivity, which is the ability of a substance to transfer heat during a temperature difference. We'll see that metals usually have a high thermal conductivity, and water does as well compared to other liquids. To end the video, and having these factors in mind that we've just seen, let's look at some adaptations of seals and the black-throated loons. So starting with thermal conductivity, we have that seals have blubber which insulates and hence prevents heat loss. Then we have the oiled exterior feathers that they have, which exclude water, and these feathers also trap air, serving as insulators as well, and again preventing heat loss. Moving on to buoyancy, we have that these seals have low density blubber that increases the buoyancy, which makes it easier for them to reach the surface. Now the black-throated loon has large wings that lifts less buoyant air. Pretty simple. Now seal babies survive in layers, so in groups, which are insulated by air and again prevent heat loss. We're going to look at something here because we don't have a specific adaptation of black-throated loons when it comes to specific heat capacity. Now looking at viscosity, seals have a hydrodynamic shape, so a shape that is beneficial to move in water as it reduces drag, and black-throated loons have a both hydrodynamic shape for the water and aerodynamic shape for when they're in the air to also reduce drag. Now, because there's no adaptation here, let's just talk about capillary action. So what its definition is essentially the ability of a liquid to move along a narrow space without external forces helping it. Okay, so this was missing from a previous slide. That would be it for today. Make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe, everything.